Hello, Scott, and welcome to the Hidden Why podcast. Or should I say, welcome back to the Hidden Why podcast?
Oh, thank you for having me back again. It's great to be here.
Great to have you back, mate. And I'm not sure if we did a video last time, but good to see you. You're looking well. And
Oh,
you've
thank
written a
you.
new book, Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery, off the back of your previous book, obviously, that we talked about, Ultralearning.
Yeah. No, I'm excited to talk about that too.
Very exciting subject. And I think for the people that listen to this podcast, at least, most of us want to be able to improve and grow, and that's what it's
Hmm.
about,
Yeah.
growth. I think growth in life, and something that I missed for many years of my life, after school at least, is that part of growth and learning, you know?
Yeah. I mean, like the highest highs of our life are when we can really get a grasp on something that like was struggling for us. We were having difficulty, and then I'm getting it. I'm good at this. I mean, it's an experience that really drives me to understand the research, write these books.
Yeah. What does it mean to you, learning and growth? Like what is that all about for you personally?
Well, I mean, this has been just a real through line for my whole career. We've been talking about how, the last book was Ultralearning. I decided to write more about this topic because I felt like there was still more to say. There's more to say about the ideas that go behind, how do you get better at things? And for me, the idea of learning is really just an expanding of the things you know, of the things that you can do, and the possibilities that you see for your life. So it's really central, I think, to flourishing as a human being.
Absolutely. In your life, what has led you to, researching and writing on such topics?
Yeah, I mean, when we probably talked about it when we were talking ultra learning, that's probably about 5 years ago. But I mean, I got started in this. I was writing a website where I was writing about student advice. I was a student. I was giving studying tips, and after that, I did some intensive self-directed learning projects. I did one called the MIT Challenge, learning MIT's four-year computer science curriculum over 12 months. I learned multiple languages. Learning portrait drawing, quantum mechanics, other things like this, documenting on my website. And this was a real interest of mine of like learning things, learning specific things that I wanted to figure out. Well, what does the research say? What does the science say about how people learn? How can we learn better? So I can, try to take some of the experiences that work for me, but generalize them and try to apply them to a wider group of people. And also for my own interest, for the skills that I'd like to learn in the future.
Yeah, not just about work necessarily, is it? It's about life in
Yeah.
general, like just learning to be, I guess, better at life and
Yeah.
find more joy in life.
Yeah, I mean, our work is like such an important part of our lives. And so being
Right.
good at our jobs, being good at the skills that pay us money is like an obvious economic material incentive to learn things. But I mean, even our hobbies, even like, whether you like skiing or whether you like playing basketball or golf or these kind of things depends a lot on, do I feel like I'm capable of do I feel like I'm capable of getting better at those
Yeah.
things? And so if you feel like you're stuck, if you feel like, I'm not that good at this and I don't know how to get any better, then it can be frustrating, right? So I think it encompasses far more than just the things that pay off in monetary terms.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, we spend so much time at work every day. It's important to
Mhm.
have, I think, learning is part of that, and if you just went
Yeah,
into work and weren't progressing or weren't learning or weren't growing, you're going to be pretty dissatisfied with your life in general if that's, half your day where you spend your time.
definitely. And I mean, so much of our professional lives are also geared around, maybe we'd like to do something with our work. Maybe we'd like to work in a different field, a different industry, move
Mm.
up in our careers, start a business. And there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of trepidation surrounding, like, do I think I could do this? Do I think I have the ability to pull it off? And so, I mean, it's not obviously it's a lot of work to try to make progress. I don't want to say that you can just read a book and it'll happen instantaneously, but if you know the principles behind how it works, I think it can help you give that confidence to like, you know what, I'm gonna try to take on a new project. I'm gonna try to take on a new role that maybe I wouldn't have felt confident to do before.
Yeah. So we talked about ultra learning last time, and we're
Mhm.
talking about, get better at anything this time. What's the bridge between the two books? Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so with ultra learning, my focus was a little bit more narrow. I wanted to look at people who were taking on these intensive self directed learning projects, obviously using some of my own stories, but also focusing on people who were kind of extreme in some way, that they had taught themselves
Right.
difficult skills. I have people
Tons of
creating their
examples in
own
there.
video games, learning every single part of video game design, people learning like a dozen languages, these sort of extreme individuals. One of the stories that kind of bridged this gap of like wanting to write about the new book was learning about people getting really good at Tetris. And Tetris may seem like kind of a trivial subject, but it was one of those ones that when you dig into it, it reveals a principle that applies really broadly everywhere. So
Right.
Tetris is a game that came out about 30 years ago, and people were obsessed with it. I mean, there was people playing it all the time, so much that they even called it the Tetris effect, that people were like hallucinating falling blocks. This is back in the early 90s. But if
Yeah.
you look at the world record performance, so the records they keep for the best possible Tetris players,
Right.
the people of that era weren't actually that good. Now there's like 12-year-old, 13-year-old kids that are like unfathomably better than the people were back in that era. And what was the
Hmm.
difference? Well, the difference is that the people today have the internet, they have live streamers, they have people that they can study and learn from so that the best techniques get transmitted directly and they can, really use the best practices right away. Whereas before it used to be, well, maybe your brother's older friend knows some trick and you can learn it from
Right.
them, but that's all it goes from.
They didn't have that
And
access to information.
no, and this turns out to be like a really relevant principle for learning at work, for learning on the job, because if you're in an environment where you can learn from the best people who are performing a craft, you can see what they're doing, you can see how they're doing it is documented and shared, you can progress a lot faster. Whereas if you don't have that, you can't. And so what was different between this and the previous book is that this wasn't really a story about an individual at all, but a story about how changes in the environment and finding the right environment could make such a big difference in the possibility not of just getting better as an individual, but getting better as an organization or getting better
Right.
as for an entire field or discipline.
Interesting. And that, yeah, I can think of so many different examples in my personal life where, that environment would certainly have a greater impact in what I'm trying to achieve or do. So
Yeah, yeah,
you're suggesting it's not just about, I guess, the internet. That's just the story about, how we have access
yeah.
to information in our environment that we surround ourselves with can help have more an impact on what we're trying to achieve. Um,
Yeah. So I mean,
like surrounding
it,
yourself by the five best people or five, the people you surround yourself with, that sort of story.
well, I think that does help. I mean, obviously we get like this sort of unconscious influence from other people, but
Hmm.
more just how the ability to learn from other people, the ability to have an environment that facilitates that is so important. And so in this book, I spent a lot more time looking at not individuals, but whole systems for learning. So again, we're talking about this Tetris example to start, but I have a whole section where we're talking about pilot training and what we found from that, and people who are science fiction book authors and jazz improvisers, and this sort of how different cultures and setups and environments that how they can facilitate and constrain learning, and what factors we need to be looking for when we're choosing where to learn, choosing how to learn and how to improve.
Okay. So the environment, what should we be looking at as far as what factors we need to consider when we're trying to learn something or progress?
Well, I think the most important factor, and this is the one that we were talking about with the Tetris example, is how easy is it to learn from other people? So I divide the book into see, do, feedback, and see is the idea that most of what we know comes from other people. And so the extent to which best practices, the right way to do things, the techniques, the tricks, the mental models, the concepts are transparent and open to us is going to make a huge difference of whether or not we're able to get quickly to the ballpark of where the best people are performing in the field, or whether we are just stuck at square one for a very long time. And
Hmm.
so obviously, when we're thinking about, like, let's say your business life or your where you're working, where you choose to work can make a big difference. I mean, it can make a big difference if you are like the only person with a specialty at your firm and there's not that many other people you can learn from, versus if you're at a company where there's lots of people who are doing it, or maybe even people who are doing cutting edge work, is going to make a big difference of whether you're able to progress.
So being able to see it and, yeah, I guess have that knowledge around you so you can improve in that particular sector is
Hmm.
important. And I can see that in organizations, the organizations that thrive and the organizations that don't, but also the individuals that succeed quite well. They generally surround themselves and plug into that environment of people, so they can
Yeah.
continually learn.
Well, and I think it also shows a difference between maybe more like academic learning and learning on the job, and why that social piece is so important because like in school, you're given the book, you're given the examples, you're saying, okay, here and study this. And so it's just, kind of your raw brain power determines how well you learn. Whereas I think
Mm.
what a lot of people have learned in these sort of, on the job context is that because it's not always transparent, because you have to like know someone who knows someone, or you have to know the skill, or you have to be able to ask the question of the person, and it's not written down everywhere. It just this social dimension, the communication involved to learn these things becomes so important. So it
Yeah.
was an aspect that I was very interested in exploring because, obviously it's so important for a lot of the real world skills we care about.
Yeah, I was terrible at well, I wasn't terrible at school, but getting the textbook and having to study. Yeah, I could do it. And I could spend hours doing it, and I could try and ace the test, but it didn't last.
Yeah.
And I found certainly in life that me being around someone who has that skill that I desire to improve in pays off um, big time. What can we do in that seeing sort of what can we do to improve that part? If we're trying to, progress in something, what things should we be looking for?
Yeah. So I think the basic idea and the basic concept that's very important is being able to see how people solve problems. Because often we're dealing with problems, and problem solving is this inherently mental activity of, you're
Mm,
thinking in your head of how you're working through it. And the difficulty is that when you are familiar with the situation, when you have a lot of experience, this problem solving steps you go with, it often becomes something you do almost reflexively, almost unconsciously. And so you
right.
can, if you've ever seen someone who's really good at something and they just seem to do it, and you ask them, well,
Yeah.
how did you do that? Like a classic example is like
Yeah.
someone, maybe who's really good at drawing, right? And they just draw something and it looks like the thing that they're drawing. And maybe you're just drawing stick figures and you're like, how did you do that? And they're just like, oh, well, you just draw it the way that it looks, which is not always helpful advice. And so some of the challenge that we have in learning from other people, and this is true on the job, especially when you have people that maybe have been in the career for 10 years, is how do you surface the stuff that is, automatic for them? They don't think about it, or is so obvious that they don't even want to mention it. And so, I have a whole chapter where we talk about like, how do you do interviews, like this kind of thing that we're doing
Mm,
right now to try to
mm.
surface those issues, surface those details that will seem obvious to the person, but maybe it's not obvious to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I totally get it. That second nature sort of thing, and I'm guilty of it myself, where you just do things and you've got some, younger apprentice there,
Yeah.
but you're just like, I don't know, it's just natural to me. But because you've been doing it for
Yeah.
so long, there is obviously something that you've learnt along the way. So how do you open that up to stop those boundaries? And I think um, definitely in my life, I've seen it where people um, generally close off because they don't want to share. And I don't know if it's
Hmm.
about being, mean or unfair, but I don't know. They feel like if they're sharing, they're going to give up something that's theirs. Whereas I've been one to being just always, you know what, this is what I do, and I'm happy to give it to anyone, and you can do the same thing. That's fine. So there's that. But what else is there as far as being able to go, okay, well, this is a problem that I'm good at solving, but I don't know how to teach that. How can you open
Yeah.
that up?
I mean, I think one of the things, the sort of starting point is just to try to document what it is that this person's doing. And
Right.
again, we kind of focus very much on this very high level. So
Mm,
one of the methods that cognitive psychologists use who do this kind of cognitive task analysis is this critical decision method, where basically you get them to look at a decision they made or a situation they faced, and you walk them through kind of like, okay, what did you do this time? Why did you do this? What was this? And basically, you break it down like if you were a journalist, kind of tracking a story to figure out beat by beat what is happening. And you
right.
can, we've applied this. My one of my frequent collaborators and I, we applied this in one of our courses, Top Performer, to helping students with career decisions, of like figuring out someone who really understands the career path, understands how it works, and get them to interview one of those people. And don't ask them for advice. Don't ask them to tell you like, here's what you should be doing with your life, because then you're going to get a little like platitude ridden speech. Instead, say like, exactly what did you do? Walk me through step by step what you did to get where you're at. And often you're going to hear advice that is just it's going to surprise you. It's not going to be something that you expected. When I got into writing books and working with a traditional publisher, there was lots of stuff that I didn't know. Like I didn't know that authors typically don't write the book first. They write something called a proposal, and they get an agent first, and they get the agent to
Yeah.
pitch the proposal. And like these are things that if you've spent any time in traditional publishing, you're like, well, duh. But if you've never written a book before, and if you've ever met someone who's never written a book before, they're like, wait, what are you talking about? What's an advance, or what's this kind of thing? And so these little details, once you understand them, once you understand how it works, like, oh, this is the kind of thing that you have to do. These are the kind of things that you have to work on. I mean, in a career context, it makes sense, but it works down to the level of an individual problem. Like, why did you fix the plumbing that way? Well, because I don't want it to do this. And, this way you're
Yeah. Okay.
surfacing that knowledge that's important.
So documenting the process, and I think part of that would be to ask many, many questions, because I think,
Mhm.
again, if you're asking someone about the process they went through to get to where they are, or to do a little
Yeah.
task, again, they might take it for granted, not be able to answer it as you'd like to. So you have to sort of delve deeper by asking questions, right?
Yeah, and I think again, focusing on what people do and not always their advice is helpful too, because again, advice encapsulates more this kind of abstract. Okay, here's what I think is important in general,
Right.
whereas what you actually do, again, it contains all these really like, well, this is too obvious to mention, but oh, okay, what are you doing right there? Why are you doing that?
So observing.
Um, and so that's really important. Yeah.
What can you do? Just a bit of advice, and it's sort of off a little bit off tangent, but
Mhm.
if you're wanting to learn something, to find someone that can give you that learning, what what would you advise there? Because I mean, did you go out there and try and reach authors to ask them about the process and figure out how they did it?
Like how to write books. Well, I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do.
Not
So
not
I
to write
think,
books necessarily, but to
oh yeah,
find someone that can be that
give
person, so
that
you can learn
advice.
from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first place is to look for communities, I think, and to look for environments like what we were talking about. So, I talk about the science fiction author Octavia Butler, who just had these like years of struggle where she was like trying to get published and just like constant rejection slips. And then she goes to this Clarion science fiction workshop where she's with a room of a bunch of other science fiction writers. The person at the front of the stage is a published author, and they're working together. And soon after that, she's selling her manuscripts and she's making progress. And the reason why is that you're surrounded by a bunch of people. And even if those people are not collectively, they know the whole picture, they know a little bit, and then they can aggregate it together. So that's my first suggestion.
Yeah.
If you are like trying to get into a skill, find a group, find a community, find some place where people are practicing it. Because even if any individual person in that group is not the number one expert, as a whole, as an aggregate, you're probably going to learn some things you don't know, even if maybe you are, if you do know quite a few things. And then the second thing I think is, again, doing this process of like identifying people. So once you find someone that you think, okay, person might be a mentor, again, figure out what is the thing that you're struggling with, and break it down, get a chance to like beat by beat, how would this person solve this problem? And often you're able to
Mm,
surface things like that too. So I think
I like it.
communities are a good place to start. In
Yeah.
a professional context, finding the right place to work is often
Yeah.
important, because if you're in an environment where it's easy to learn from other people, you can quickly get up to skill at a job. If you're, again, the only
I
person who
love
knows how
that.
to do something at a firm, it might take a long time.
Yeah. 100%. So see, do feedback. What's the next step? So we're learning. It's obviously taking action, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, practice is super important, and it's kind of an obvious thing if you want to get better at something. But I think one of the things that I found really interesting, kind of diving into the research, is just what exactly practice is doing. And I think there's sometimes this myth that if you just do something enough, if you just do it repeatedly for a really, really long time, you're going to naturally just get better and better and better, and you're not going to stall out. And
Does
that's
that
just
sort of
not
come
the
off the
case.
10,000 hour rule or whatever? Is that?
Well, I mean, that was definitely a popularization. And the funny thing is the 10,000 hour rule. Like, this is Malcolm Gladwell. He publishes
Yeah.
this book, Outliers, and it's based on this research by Anders Ericsson on deliberate practice. And the funny thing is that popular interpretation, like just do something for 10,000 hours and you're going to become an expert at it, was not the conclusion that Anders Ericsson drew about it. It was definitely not the case that you just spend 10,000 hours doing
No.
something and you become world class. And the reason why, and I think this is a good example to illustrate it, is that doing something repeatedly makes the actions that you're doing more and more automatic. It makes it easier to perform those actions. But
Yes.
in some ways, it also makes it harder to improve because you're thinking about what you're doing less. So, to give an example, you're typing on a
Right.
keyboard. There's two ways you can do it. You can do the touch typing method where you have the hands on the home row and you move each finger to hit each key, or you can hunt and peck with one or maybe two fingers to type out an email. Now, if you hunt and peck, if you're one of these people that hunts and pecks and you do it for 10 years, that's not going to spontaneously evolve into touch typing. You're going to just hunt and peck a little faster, a little faster, a little faster. And so you can get stuck with a kind of inferior method and plateau way, way below than you could with even, a month of practicing touch typing. And
Mm.
so in this sense, practice is this kind of double-edged sword that it's very important. Obviously, it's very important for getting good at things, but we also need to be careful about what kind of practice we're doing, because this effort-saving tendency of the brain to just make these procedures automatic can also make it harder to improve in some cases if we're practicing the wrong things.
Is that why they say, a lot of the successful or elite performers are lifelong learners? They're constantly focusing on their art and constantly trying to find ways to improve.
Definitely, and I think that that's something like in our jobs when we're doing something. I've been writing essays for close to 20 years now, and it would be nice to think that just, well, if I just keep writing essays every year, I just get steadily better. But I don't
Mm.
think that's the way that works. I think that probably after about a year or two, whatever essay writing ability I had would have plateaued. So any improvements that I've made since then have been because of deliberate efforts to like not write the way that I'm writing right now, to do something that's beyond that. And that doesn't happen
Right.
automatically. You can
Interesting.
definitely just write for 1 or 2 years and then just coast for after that. So, I mean, not everyone needs to be the best at everything they do, and you have to be very selective about where you're going to apply this effort. But I
Yeah.
think understanding that principle is important, because if you just take for granted that 10,000 hours is going to get you there, you might get to 9,000 hours and be like, oh, maybe not.
Absolutely. And I love that book by Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 Hours, and it got me excited. But then there was a follow-up book, wasn't there, about the practice and Anders Ericsson's work about how it needs to be thoughtful or intense and things like that. What
Yeah.
is it that we need to do in our doing stage to improve on our learnings?
Well, I think again, there's going back to this idea. I think the seeing idea gets us to sort of the ballpark. So we know the best practices. We know this is what we should be doing. This is sort of like the knowledge and mental models we
Yeah.
need. And then the doing is making those processes smoother, more automatic, so that they require less mental overhead to do. And that's very important for, especially for complicated skills. If you think about reading, for instance, reading is something that we like, most of us take for granted. You just look and you read, but it's actually an extremely complicated process going in your head. You have to like recognize each individual letter and figure out which sounds they make. And if you're talking about English, at least, they don't always consistently make the same sound. So you have to know that for each word, and then you have to parse it together, and then you have to like figure out what it means. It's this enormously complicated process, and it's only possible that you can do it at all because you've done it so much that it's become unconscious, that it's become automatic. And so I think the idea here is that, in the beginning, understand the best practices. You need to keep practicing. You need to do it to make those components automatic. And then there's a process of like iteratively adjusting, so that, maybe you're tweaking little mistakes or little things that you had that you got wrong in the sort of starting process, so you can make improvements.
Right. Do you have reminders or tools for yourself that allow you to go, okay, well, I'm doing this thing, but this is what I'm going to do to make sure I'm not doing it, to make sure I'm continually
Yeah.
improving? Like, do you have any
Well,
triggers?
I think there's lots of different ways, and it depends on the exact kind of field you're in. But I mean, for
Mm.
writing or for what I'm doing, a lot of what I like to do is focus on projects that introduce a new set of constraints. And the new set of constraints can sometimes push you away from bad habits that maybe you have developed, or maybe they're not even bad habits. They're just kind of old habits. They're just things that maybe you rely on too much. So,
Yeah.
for instance, when I was I was thinking about this in this process of writing this book, that when I started writing, I started by blogging, and blogging was a very personal format, very much the genre of writing lent itself to, and here's what I think about X. That was sort of how the writing style worked. And so when I wrote my first book, I got to lean on that a little bit because I told some personal stories. And so whenever I reached an impasse with my writing where I wasn't quite sure exactly how I would, back up a point, it felt very natural to just be like, and this is what I think about this. And writing this book, I wanted to push myself more to a more journalistic style of writing where you're not just like filling in the gaps with your opinion. You're talking to experts, you're following up on the research. And I don't want to say that that always makes for better writing, but it is a constraint that kind of forced me away from like, a crutch that maybe I had used in the past.
Right. How did you do, like, how did you find those constraints? Like, did you see that in your first work that that was
Mhm.
a limitation of your work, being that it was more personally based than research based?
Well, it's not that it's a limitation always. I mean, I think with a creative field, with a stylistic field, like these are, I guess you could call them almost stylistic choices. And so I think they only become a difficulty when you need to use them.
Mm.
Like as a creative choice is like, well, I don't have another way of solving this problem, so I'm going to lean on what I already know. So I think developing your skills in a creative profession, which is less about like right answer, wrong answer, but more do you know one way of doing this or do you know six ways of doing it? You can pick the one that you think is best for this situation. And so pushing yourself outside of what you know how to do with constraints, with like design constraints, is one way of doing that. Now, I mean, how do you figure out what are the things that you're doing wrong and what are the things that you should be doing? I think that's part of that is from seeing other people. So part of it is, again, going back to this seeing idea, like reading books and figuring out how do they work? How is this author doing what they're doing? Um,
Mm.
is big because then you're noticing, oh, they can do something with their writing that I can't, and I'd like to try to do that. And maybe I won't succeed right away, but I like that they're telling a story in two parts and they're splitting it up, or they're telling multiple short stories, or they're starting with something that's not a story, or there's various
Yeah.
devices that they're using, and you like that. In other cases, it's even just again from this communal knowledge of like talking to other writers and having them be like kind of like, oh yeah, this kind of technique I don't like this, and then it kind of clues you into it and you're like, well, what are you talking about? And then you
Right.
zoom in on it and you realize you're using it. Like an
What
example I can give
inspired
of
you
that
to
is,
write
yeah.
differently? Like, what inspired you to write in this new
Well,
style
I
for
don't.
this book?
I think I write differently all the time. I think I'm always
Yeah.
trying to push myself in new directions. And so in this particular case, I think it was a challenge to myself to just sort of be like, you know, um, could I write a book where it was, I'm not trying to fill as many of these gaps with like, here's
Okay.
just what I think about this. And but I mean, there's other books I could have gone in a completely different direction. I mean, I think one of the other ideas I had, which was not the way that I went with the book, is I really admire some writers who have like extremely like terse epigrammatic kind of way of writing that like every sentence they write is very quotable. And like, I mean, that's a totally different direction, totally different set of constraints that could lead to a very different kind of writing. Like I'm thinking of like a James Clear or a Derek Sivers or someone like that. And
Mm.
so, again, you see some idea, you see this constraint, and maybe that could have been the constraint of writing a different book of like, okay, every single paragraph has to have a sentence that you would like, you would feel good like
Right.
excising from the book and like treating a new catchphrase or some kind of slogan. So those are different ways of constraining your writing to push yourself to try new things.
So seeking out constraints to put on yourself to make you do it or think
Yeah.
about it in a different manner.
Well, I think the constraint approach to getting this kind of deliberate practice is very important for creative works, which you really can only do in the totality of it. Like you have to, you can't only do part of writing an essay. But I mean, if we're talking about, other kinds of skills, there's other ways you can get the same effect. Like if you were trying to work on basketball, you can like practice your 3 pointers. You don't have to do a whole game. You can just isolate this like one aspect and just do it, and do it from different points in the court, and you keep practicing and practicing to just focus on that one aspect so you can improve that ability, which might the opportunity might only come up a handful of times in the game. And
Yeah.
so the same idea is there, but I mean the mechanism and tools that you use to reach it are going to be different.
Right. So it's got to be inspired or backed by passion or curiosity for your art or whatever you're trying to do, right? Because you're not going to put constraints on yourself uh, for stuff that you're not interested in.
No, obviously. And I mean, this is something that's come up when I've been talking about this book is like the title of the book, I called it Get Better at Anything and not Get Better at Everything because, well, like obviously you're not going to get better at everything. I mean, most things you don't care to improve, and that's totally fine. That's normal. But I think it's the things that you want to get better at, and especially the things you want to get better at, which maybe you're not getting better at, or you're struggling to get better at, or you're looking at someone else and you're like, oh, I wish I could do it like that person. I mean, that's where I think bringing force to bear the entire like
That
edifice
should
of
be
like
a
what we know
trigger.
about how skills work should be something useful to you, you know?
I love it. Great information and a great book, a great couple of books, really. And I think it's inspirational, Scott, for me at least, and for the audience, I'm sure, to have this conversation because you're right. There's so many things that I'm thinking about right now in my life. There's a lot of things that I don't care about and I don't need to get better at, and I'm happy to leave
Yeah.
on autopilot. But there's so many things that I do love and I am passionate about, but I don't put in enough the see-do feedback, I guess, into that art. So I think you've left me feeling inspirational to go out there and go, you know what? These are the couple of key areas that I really want to improve in, and thinking about how I can bring a bit of this into that to and again, bring more joy into life, because I think that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Definitely. It's not all just drudgery and grinding it out. It's about how do you get more of the things that you really care about.
Yeah. Well, I think you've left a positive tone there, mate. Appreciate you coming back on, Scott, and congratulations on the new book. Hope it goes really well. Any
Oh, thank you
final
very
message
much.
for the audience, or where can people reach you?
Yeah, so they can come to my website at scotthyoung.com if they're interested. And the book is available on Amazon, Audible, wherever you get your books. If you're interested in diving deep into the process of getting better at things, the book is there.
Love it. So I'll stick those links in the show notes, so you guys can reach out to Scott, grab a copy of his book, and have a read of that, and take on the challenge to improve in some aspect or many aspects of your life. Thank you, Scott, for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so
Till
much.
next time, guys. Peace, passion, and purpose. See you soon.